Let me begin by firstly introducing myself. I'm Sujan Chinoy, the Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. And it's the greatest of pleasures for me this morning to welcome you all to our webinar seminar on interpreting the South China Sea's significance in the Indo-Pacific. And we have a stellar lineup today of speakers. But before I proceed to introducing the program and the speakers in brief, I would simply like to suggest a few housekeeping chores here. The first is that when a speaker takes the floor, all the rest of us must mute our mics, please, at all times, because that prevents the echo from coming back to the speaker. So may I at this stage, since I have the floor, may I request all others to kindly mute their mics, not their videos, because we really do want to see you there. But please do mute your mics at this stage. When you're called upon to speak, you may kindly unmute your mics when you're called upon to speak. And that will really help all of us. I want to briefly introduce the program. I'm going to pontificate, make a statement for about 10 minutes, and I hope you will bear with me if I overshoot by a couple of minutes. We will then have a keynote address by His Excellency Ambassador Pham San Chau, the Ambassador of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to India. Thereafter, we will have an address on Australia, the South China Sea, and the Indo-Pacific by Professor Leszek Buzinski, Honorary Professor with the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University, Canberra. And I'm familiar with the ANU, having done a posting in Australia. One of my best postings in the past was in Australia, in Sydney. Then we will have Professor Hideshi Tokuchi, who will speak on the South China Sea and Japan's perspective. He's an old friend from my time, most recently as Ambassador of India to Japan. Thereafter, we will have Dr. Bin Thai Lai, Deputy Director General of the East Sea Institute, Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam in Hanoi. And for those that don't know the East Sea, please note that this is the name by which Vietnam calls the South China Sea. And there is every reason to do so. He will speak like the rest for about 15 minutes. And last but not the least, we will have my colleague, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, Senior Research Associate and Coordinator of the Southeast Asia and Oceania Center at our institute. He will speak on the South China Sea in the Indo-Pacific. Thereafter, we plan to have a short Q&A session. If we spill over into the Q&A session, the session itself, of course, will get truncated somewhat. So with these few words, let's start the proceedings, and I will begin my introductory remarks, the opening remarks, so to speak. And I begin formally by acknowledging His Excellency Pham San Chau, Ambassador of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to India, all distinguished participants from Vietnam, Australia, and Japan, ladies and gentlemen who are attending this seminar, a very good morning to all of you. Today we are hosting a very timely webinar with the Embassy of Vietnam in New Delhi on the theme Interpreting South China Sea's Significance in the Indo-Pacific. In the South China Sea, let me state at the very outset that the sharpening regional geopolitical contestations are increasingly reflected and rooted in China's preposterous claims, the occupation of reefs and islands, the creation of artificial features, and above all, their militarization. China's aggressive tactics have pitted it against Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and many others. It has also sought to bully Indonesia insofar as Indonesia's exclusive economic zone is concerned. But first, a few words about India-Vietnam relations are in order. Our bilateral ties with Vietnam have been transformed in recent years. There exists a growing convergence of interests between us in the Indo-Pacific. As chair of ASEAN, Vietnam is a key pillar of India's Act East policy. As non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council beginning the 1st of January 2021, I suppose new areas of collaboration will emerge between our two countries. My institute has 3 MOUs with Vietnamese think tanks. I myself visited Vietnam last year for interactions, very productive interactions. We had this dialogue last year with the Institute for Defense Strategy, IDS. Later, I had the honor to renew our MOU with that institute in the presence of the 2 defense ministers when the defense minister of Vietnam visited India. Friends, we live in a world which is undergoing a fundamental transformation today. The fragile international compact that prevailed till the end of last year has been rendered a mortal blow by the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has exposed flaws in multilateral structures and national capacities, if I could mention that as well. It has caused about a fundamental retrenchment of multilateralism as well. There are several facets to this emerging uncertainty. International relations are increasingly marked by a proclivity to weaponize trade and technology. Power is fractured in every part of the world. Hedging and multi-alignment are part of every country's strategic toolkit today. The sheer pace at which China is changing is also a factor for disruption. It has enhanced the complexity of how we view the geostrategic changes. China's unilateralism, aggression, and if I could put it that way, revanchism in seeking an alteration of territorial boundaries ranging from the East China Sea to the South China Sea, all the way to the high mountains of Ladakh. This kind of behavior has intensified rivalries and contestations. China's rise itself has not been smooth, far from being smooth. China's unilateralism, the militarization that is in place of its economic power, and the aggression, all this, including the obfuscation of facts and truth, has invited a pushback along a very broad front. In our case, in the case of India, we stand resolute on the borders. We are determined to guard our sovereignty and territorial integrity, come what may. At the same time, of course, we would prefer a resolution of differences through dialogue. But that will not be at the cost of our sovereignty and territorial integrity. We have made it abundantly clear to China that restoration of peace and tranquility on our borders is a prerequisite. It's key to the conduct of normal ties in the future. Today, geo-economic forces unleashed by China's economic rise are redefining the geostrategic landscape of the entire Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific, in my view, is a recognition of the natural spread of economic growth and prosperity in recent years over a much wider region beyond East Asia and beyond Southeast Asia, to include the broad swathe of South Asia and all the way up to the east coast of Africa. The Indo-Pacific is certainly more inclusive and can better accommodate and reflect the growing aspirations of a much wider constituency as compared to the term Asia-Pacific. It is also a recognition of the two oceans being interconnected and interdependent, especially at a time when security in this maritime space remains indivisible, increasingly indivisible. However, a note of caution here, economic success in the Indo-Pacific has not been matched at all by a corresponding strategic consensus on the emergence of a stable security architecture. The region witnesses some of the highest military expenditures in the world. It has some of the most intractable territorial disputes anywhere in the world. The Indo-Pacific is contested space where China is seeking to fundamentally begin the redefinition of the world order by virtually seeking, in my view, an expulsion of the United States from its periphery. This has implications for the region's ability to have enduring peace and stability, or to secure a prosperous Indo-Pacific in the future. China remains wedded to the concept of the Asia-Pacific because a switch to the Indo-Pacific implies erosion of its preeminence. China is a member of UNCLOS, yet engages in activities that contradict UNCLOS. It has refused to accept UNCLOS rulings, for instance. The US position is interesting. The US position on the South China Sea is amongst the most significant ones. It is the key fulcrum of the strategic equilibrium as it has prevailed over the past 70 years. The US focus on the international war on terror in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks created, in my view, a drift in US policy towards the Asia Pacific. It left a vacuum in the South China Sea, which China quickly sought to fill in through artificial building of islands and their militarization, through the declaration of artificial and arbitrary air defense identification zones, etc. This trend has accelerated, particularly after the coming to power of President Xi Jinping. The US pivot towards Asia and its rebalancing policy, in my view, came in a little too late in the day. Although the US and its key allies maintain a robust maritime posture in the South China Sea and conduct FONOPs and challenge the arbitrary Chinese eddies, these are not quite adequate to ensure restoration of status quo ante. These are, at best, tactical measures. The International Court of Justice's PCA ruling of 2016 that went against China proved to be a turning point in many ways. It drew attention to the importance of respecting rule of law and adherence by signatories of UNCLOS to its fundamental tenets. Even more significant now is the latest announcement by the United States last month at the level of their Secretary of State about the US's position on the South China Sea. The US position now is fully in alignment with the Tribunal Award of 2016. When the Tribunal Award came about in 2016, the US had called upon the two parties involved in the arbitration to abide by the PCA award. It had then stated that the matter was quite technical and still under study in terms of the substance of the matter. But in 2020, in August 2020, the US has finally aligned its own position with the findings of the PCA, the substance of the matter. And that I think is another point of inflection for all of us. ASEAN centrality, no doubt, is key, as every Quad member has also quite explicitly stated. But it also means that ASEAN's lack of consensus on China and the yet to be finalized code of conduct add to the complexity. ASEAN centrality figured once again at the 36th ASEAN summit held on 26 June, when some Southeast Asian leaders boldly raised the issue of the South China Sea and called out China's bullying behavior. ASEAN chair Vietnam called for a rules-based order in the South China Sea. Even the president of the Philippines, who has swung in terms of his position on China, he spoke out, calling for respect for UNCLOS. Ironically, in my view, ASEAN's dependence on China is growing, both for its prosperity as well as for its security. The 10 ASEAN states seem to speak out as a group when they meet, but individually they seem to want to avoid having to take sides between China and the United States. Now, that may include Vietnam, and pardon me for saying this in the presence of the ambassador, but that's just an academic opinion. Because otherwise, Vietnam is among the most affected by China's predatory tactics. But I suppose that can be called strategic autonomy as well. So that's for further academic examination. as to how Vietnam, being the most affected, also will be constrained or obliged to balance its ties. And the going can get rough if there is some kind of an open confrontation between the United States and China. The going can get rough for the Vietnamese in their own assessment. ASEAN centrality affords China an opportunity to dilute narratives in the Indo-Pacific that could prove inimical to Chinese interests. And why so? Because after all, it is only China that is involved directly in the Code of Conduct negotiations. And its outcome, which will decide the fate of the Indo-Pacific, is actually something that's being negotiated by China with the ASEAN countries, and not by the United States or Australia or Japan or India or anyone else that's affected. Nuanced differences between the Quad countries of the past in terms of the definition of the Indo-Pacific, they seem to have narrowed down in the last 2 years. There are common references to the creation of a free, open, and inclusive regional architecture, rules of the road, freedom of navigation and overflight, and of course, ASEAN centrality. There is pragmatic appreciation of late among the Quad countries that not all nations grappling with the rise of China are necessarily sharing the same systems of governance, as in what is notionally regarded as democratic systems as perceived by the West. Asia has its own mix of systems of governance, and therefore I draw your attention to the fact that the word democracies has been dropped actually in the last 2 years from the pronouncements of the Quad, because there is acknowledgement that there are many countries with different systems of political governance that are also affected by China's arbitrary behavior and would like to be on board the growing consensus in the Indo-Pacific. There is a broader dialogue today in the Quad Plus format as well that involves countries that are quite far away, like Israel and Brazil on the one flank, and of course, in the thick of things, South Korea, New Zealand, and Vietnam are also part of that broader dialogue. On our part, India is fully committed to an inclusive security architecture for the region on the basis of respect for rule of law, freedom of navigation and overflight, equal access to the commons and its natural resources, and resolution of disputes through dialogue. This includes the South China Sea, of course, and India believes that there is no room for unilateralism and coercive behavior of the type that threatens peace and development in the region. My Prime Minister Modi's initiatives to develop the blue economy, particularly in the context of SAGAR, the acronym, the full form of which is Security and Growth for All in the region. These initiatives are aimed at bringing India closer to Indian Ocean littoral countries through the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and also linking India to both Africa and to the ASEAN. There is a new appreciation in Southeast Asia about India's potential in offsetting China's dominance of littoral Asia. India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands can be further opened up, in my view, to friendly navies of the United States, Japan, Australia, France, friendly ASEAN countries as well, in order to promote greater naval cooperation. Likewise, India can also have greater naval cooperation on the other side of the Malacca, in terms of the Malacca patrols, etc., which are in place among ASEAN countries. The rapid spread of the coronavirus, and how can we ever forget that, has actually created fresh opportunities for dialogue. There is hope and scope for creating a new global compact if we can actually invigorate the regional and global structures, even the ones that exist, even without having to create new ones. If we can inject some new life into them, we will be able to have better discourse on a future beyond COVID-19. For the moment, it seems like pie in the sky. For every country is more concerned about its immediate economic revival, and at best, regional compromises and cooperation. Asian prosperity hinges on how well we can work together to build the foundation for our future, and how well we respect the principles of pluralism, coexistence, and dialogue. Asia is the cradle of many civilizations, each with its own dreams. Multipolarism is actually at the core of the Asian identity itself. Asia is not monolithic. There is no room for unilateralism, full stop, whether in India's neighborhood or in the Indo-Pacific, including the East and South China Seas. And so with these few words, I now request His Excellency Ambassador Pham San Chao of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to deliver his keynote address. And I thank you all for the patience with which you put up with my own opening remarks. Thank you very much. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Namaste. Am I audible? A very good morning to all of you. Excellency Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Director General of the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, distinguished panelists, and dear participants. I'm delighted and thankful for being invited to deliver a keynote speech on this important forum. I believe that this is a very timely and relevant topic. I'm of the view that the initiative and cooperation with MP-IDSA is of great importance for my mission here in New Delhi. This forum invited experts and scholars across the region to discuss two prominent issues affecting regional security and stability: South China Sea and Indo-Pacific, at both conceptual and practical level. It is imperative for us to understand what has occurred and what has been perceived, so that we could understand the nature of South China Sea and different perspectives involved. South China Sea is an established geographical concept, though differences in defining its scope have been not settled yet. South China Sea is a strategic waters of global importance, and it serves as waterways for seaborne trade with between 2,000 and 5,000 billion US dollars per year, a figure that would speak best for that. Around 80% of the global trade is seaborne, and about one-third of that goes through the South China Sea. The sea also provides a sizable quantity of hydrocarbon resources, important to economic development of coastal states, and a significant source of livelihood for all coastal communities. Million people are dependent on South China Sea for their food, protein, and life. So India is very convincing to state that South China Sea is part of global commons, which every state has state in it. Any conflict, breakout, or any disruption in this maritime crossroad would not only have material, regional, and global repercussions, but also undermine current oceanic relays order. Whereas Indo-Pacific is a new emerging concept which increasingly influence strategic thinking and decision-making in many major countries across the region. From Tokyo to New Delhi, from ASEAN capitals to Canberra, Washington, the concept is a new hit, a new geopolitical term which has drawn in new resources and also diplomatic maneuvering. In many ways, the emergence and accentuations of Indo-Pacific concept is associated with the worsening situation in South China Sea over the last decade. Send trembling message across the region. As a senior diplomat, I have many chances to observe how the issue have arisen and occupy strategic thinking and dominate regional diplomacy. So the relevance of the two concepts is really a good topic for further brainstorming and discussion. So what happened in South China Sea would worry us. And what I also want all the panelists to address thoroughly first, in my observation, the safety and security in South China Sea is worsening. Let's look at recently. South China Sea has not stabilized as many have argued. During the time of COVID-19, while the whole world is focusing on fighting the pandemic, there have been standoffs, dangerous maneuvering, and gunboat diplomacy tensions in these waterways. Fishing ships were chased and rammed arbitrarily by law enforcement. Lives of fishermen are endangered. Legitimate oil and gas operations have been obstructed. More importantly, South China Sea has become a powder keg as it has been a ground for repeated high-profile naval exercise and arms is building up. More recently, high-profile exercise was staged, HB-6 bomber is deployed, anti-ship missiles were launched. In my view, it is quite alarming when my challenge is right. Coalition undermines law and justice. Second, the law and order in South China Sea in particular and in Indo-Pacific region and general oceanic space in general has been endangered. UNCLOS, which is built as universal constitution for the oceans, has been challenged. In the South China Sea, legitimate rights of the coastal states with regard to maritime resources have been denied. There are repeated reportages of illegal obstructions of lawful actions. China Nidest Line claim, though being repudiated by the arbitrary tribunal on the 12th July 2016, continues to be enforced silently but dangerously. Even more, China named and staked sovereignty claims over what underwater features in other countries' legitimate exclusive economic zone. A new theory of foreshore has been introduced, in which the group of islets and sandbars have been enclosed as singular graphical units. Of course, waters drawn by this newborn geographical concept is even more expansive and unlawful than the night-life itself. Interestingly, in some places, imagination is now in place for rigid legal interpretation and application. Thirdly, most importantly, according to me, trust among nations has been eroding significantly, which also resulted in deteriorating relations among friendly nations and encouraged unlawful behavior and activities. Over the last decades, patience of state has running out, and diplomatic forum become a place for reciprocal blaming and criticism. While diplomacy and other peaceful means are not helpful, stronger measures are discussed and preparing. Without the prospect of peaceful settlement on the horizon, everyone is worried and seeking insurance. An unhealthy environment for diplomacy where geopolitical thinking is the main game in the show. There exist efforts to work out a regional code of conduct for the South China Sea. It has progressed for the last 3 years, which is a positive sign. Key obstacles remain. Some unreasonable claims and demands have ravaged the process. It is not very helpful if we do not have a meaningful, substantial, binding COC, which underscores universally accepted principle in terms of the United Nations Charter and UNCLOS. COC should be a continuation of UNCLOS, built upon UNCLOS, and it should not be a new UNCLOS. For a peaceful and stable maritime space, hegemonic attempts would trigger concerns and rigorous responses from other powers. The South China Sea eventually becomes a theater for great power rivalry. which is really unfortunate. What worries me most is that selfish minds and misbehavior could give you short-term advantages, but eventually breed further selfish minds and mislead. Unlawful claims and activities have their own costs, but the cost was borne by everyone. There has been some pattern of thinking and behavior in South China Sea which have been born and applied elsewhere, which have eroded the entire rule-based system which we have tirelessly built for decades. Nearsighted views and approaches also hamper all common efforts to deal with non-traditional security challenges such as climate change, environmental degradation, biodiversity, overfishing, and transnational crimes. That will adversely affect the interests of the whole community. Dear participants, the South China Sea has no longer been a storm in the teacup. It is now a regional flashpoint which would destabilize the entire region and even the global order. There have been reconsideration and shift in the position and policies of many countries, which are, to some extent, positive development. I draw your attention to the diplomatic note battle which has been taking place in New York at the UN Security Council and at the UN General Assembly, which has become a place for the related countries
Sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador. I think we are losing your audio.
and claims. Several rounds have been taking place on the extent. Am I audible? The latest note, which is launched by
Ambassador,
Malaysia,
Ambassador, sorry to
extended continental shelf in November last year. Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There are moments when the audio was a bit weak in the last few, the last few words that you mentioned. So it could be a bandwidth issue. And in that case, the only solution would be to mute the audio so that the available bandwidth goes into your mute the video so that the audio is better. So, but please proceed. The last few sentences you might like to repeat because we missed them due to an audio issue at your end, the bandwidth issue.
Am I audible now, Excellency?
Your sound is breaking. So may I suggest that you mute your video so that the available bandwidth is there for the audio? Yes, let's give it a shot again. Thank you. Yes, please. Last few sentences again, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, please. You are. Yes, Excellency. Please go ahead.
Yes. Dear participants, South China Sea has no longer been a storm in the teacup. It is becoming a regional flashpoint, which would destabilize the entire region and the global order. There have been reconsideration and shift in positions and policies of many countries that we are delighted to observe. I draw your attention to the current diplomatic nose battle, which is taking place in New York at the UN Security Council and at the UN, who has become a place for related countries to articulate their position and claims. Several rounds have been taking place. The latest one, which is launched by Malaysia's submission on the extended continental shelf report in November last year, China responded to that, and his responses have drew in notes from Vietnam, the Philippines, even United States and Australia. There emerged common position to take side not with any singular party, but with UNCLOS against specific claims and actions which violated UNCLOS. On 13 July, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo voiced opposition to China's unlawful night dash light claims and coercive actions. Australia also sent a note, not only protesting against the night dash light, against the Forcia doctrine, but also refuted strongly China's common narrative that China assertion that its sovereignty claims of the Parrikar and Spratly Island were widely recognized by the international community. Australia took note of protests by Vietnam and the Philippines to substantiate its case. This is the first time the Paracel Islands have been mentioned in a string of notes verbal submitted to CLCS since December 2019. ASEAN also stated clearly in its July statement on the chair that the 18th UNCLOS is the basis for determining maritime entitlement, sovereign jurisdictions, and legitimate interests over maritime zones. And UNCLOS set out legal states that the South China Commons and Stability Ministry spokesman Arugas, we firmly stand for the freedom of navigation and overflight and unimpeded lawful commerce in these international waterways in accordance with international law, notably UNCLOS. It is also interesting to see that new development in South China Sea has been one of the reasons for the revival of the Indo-Pacific concept. It has become a framework for regional policy of many countries such as USA, Japan, Australia, and India, and also ASEAN paperwork on Indo-Pacific. The linkages between the Indian and Pacific Ocean are perhaps natural and have existed for a long time. The trade route between Asian states, which have been dependent on economic prosperity. But Indo-Pacific is not only a physical connection, it reflects shared principles and rules. It is clear to me that the terms and of rule-based order is increasingly referred to and gain traction as the concerns for eroding order is common. Of course, there exist differences in terms of geographical interpretation and focus, but there are increased convergence on the importance of rule and the need to defend the integrity of international system, particularly UNCLOS. Therefore, there is a growing trend in the region to take side with the law, articulating clear position and stance vis-a-vis specific claims and issues. You cannot defend the rule and the law if you avoid taking position over specific issues which have already elucidated and have been regulated by international law. Against that backdrop, my dear participants, I would like to propose you all to discuss geopolitical position in South China Sea and the latest development in South China Sea, along with this slide in accordance with international law. I would like to request all the participants to discuss similarities and differences among different perceptions and approaches so that we could understand the gap among policies of major stakeholders. It would be great that you all could come up with different set of policy proposals to make sure that South China Sea would be a safe, secure. Scholars today the Institute for this initiative of making this possible. I finally believe that a frank and candid exchange will deepen our mutual understanding and enhance collective intelligence, which would result in valuable and sound policy recommendations. I would like to thank you very much, and thank you very much indeed, Mr. Excellency Chino, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ambassador Pham San Chao, for your keynote address and for highlighting some of the most important aspects of the impulse for peace and development that we all so very much want to see, not only in the South China Sea, but also in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And you are very right in pointing out that the might is right approach is undermining the principle of justice. Trust is eroding, and that there are mutual recriminations which are holding up progress in our region. And the number of times that you actually use the word law and justice in your statement only goes to show that China's arbitrariness is far removed from the notion of rule of law or justice of any kind. And that it is very important to have what you call a binding code of conduct, and hopefully you will make progress by the timeline of 2021 that you have put in place for yourselves. But I now turn to another country that's a key player in the Indo-Pacific region, Australia. And Australia has a lot riding in terms of its own interests in the ASEAN community. And therefore, it is one of the key players in the South China Sea as well. And we've seen how Australia has its own position constantly evolving from its white paper in 2017, which also spoke of not just India, but of course China as a very big partner in terms of its cooperation on the economic front. Today, Australia has assumed much stronger positions with regard to even the economic threat to its national security. Foreign direct investment is being vetted much more closely today in Australia, akin to the kind of role that CFIUS performs in the United States. And so Australia has emerged as one of the key stakeholders in the future of peace and stability in this part of the world. And I invite Professor Leszek Buzinski to kindly give us his thoughts. Please share your thoughts with us. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me all? Am I being heard? Okay, thank you.
Yes, level 5. Yes, go ahead, please.
Right, I have 15 minutes. So I'm very pleased to be invited to speak to you in this webinar. And we in Australia would in particular endorse Ambassador Sujan's remarks. That is to say, in relation to China, obfuscation of the facts. We certainly endorse that comment. And we are facing that now particular crisis with China at the moment. And China's effort to revise a world order, expel the United States from the region, we certainly endorse that one. And I might add here that we in Australia, certainly our Institute, Strategic Defence Study Centres, and some other think tanks would like to strengthen ties with India. That seems to be a weak point for us. We really want to have closer ties with security institutes, defence institutes, think tanks in India. We have, of course, we have a very good relationship with the United States and with Japan. But with India, somehow progress has been lacking. So we'd certainly like to promote that. And I hope that this particular webinar may go some way to promoting, assisting us in that direction. Now, about Australia, let me start by talking about South China Sea in a particular way, because the Chinese come to us and they say, why should you be interested in the South China Sea? It's nothing to do with you. This is Vietnam. This is the Philippines. And these countries should recognize China's sovereignty. And they're basically telling us, you should keep out. You should have nothing to do with it. Why are you involved? And their explanation is that we are involved because of the United States. We are told to be involved because of the United States, and that's the way they actually taunt us. They're saying that you actually implement orders from the US, and you have no independence of Europe, and so forth. That's the way they've been approaching us. However, look at the fundamental issue here for Australia, and that is the geopolitical significance of the South China Sea, what it means for Australia. The security community looks at it in the following way. That is to say that Australia wants to prevent any hostile power from dominating the northern approaches to Australia. And that was a particular geopolitical interest that was triggered, given form way back in the past when Japan dominated the area. And Japan actually threatened Australia with invasion, though later it transpired that Japan didn't have that intention. But that led to one fundamental relationship, and that is Australia's relationship with the United States, the alliance. This is the bedrock of Australia's security. You look at it, it's a continent. Australia is a continent. Australia is the only one country continent on Earth, and with a small population of just over 24 million. And compare that with population of Mumbai and or Shanghai or Tokyo. These are cities whose populations approximate or are greater than that of Australia. So Australia feels very vulnerable. And Australia reacts to China's behavior in the South China Sea and China's increasing influence over ASEAN. That is a very great concern of us. And hence, successive white papers have come out saying that Australia's interest is in a rules-based order. Australia's interest is in resolution of territorial disputes without resort to force. Australia's interest is in international law. And successive white papers have emphasized that point. And hence the reaction to China's, there was a very severe reaction on Australia's part to China's repudiation of the arbitral tribunal's decision in July 2016, saying that the Chinese basically said they wouldn't recognize that decision, and at the same time they had the audacity to say that they would abide by international law. This is what we call prestidigitation, obfuscation of facts on the part of the Chinese, and that had a very profound effect on decision makers, leaders here in Australia, because how can you trust the Chinese? What binds them? What actually will they follow? Now, at the same time, with regard to I've mentioned the geopolitical interest, we have a very strong economic relationship with China. And just for example, we've had uninterrupted growth until this year, since 1991, largely because our economy is being tied to China. We have the export of Australia has been exporting resources. Iron ore is number one, iron ore and coal to China. And three companies, Australian companies, supply 60% of China's iron ore imports. And in certain areas, in agriculture, for example, there's the dependence on the Chinese market is acute. For example, Chinese wool, China takes 77% of China's wool, of Australia's wool exports, 42% of Australia's wine exports, and 25% of beef exports. What this means is we have a very strong business lobby. And business people don't understand strategy, they don't understand geopolitics, they understand profit, and they are being manipulated and they are being used by the Chinese in order to put pressure on the federal government here to desist from applying pressure upon China with regard to the South China Sea. Sometimes this becomes a battle. The business community really goes up in arms with regard to this. So, however, the business community cannot overrule federal government or the security community and its conception of Australia's geopolitical interests. It's not as though you would have the business community suddenly impose its view of the China relationship in the South China Sea upon the security community. But you do find business people talking this way, and you find Chinese diplomats and so forth pointing to the business community, saying that there we are. This is Australia's true interest, and sometimes it enters into the press. Now, let me just point to some of the one other issue. That is, this is often said by, often mentioned by the Australian government, federal government. That is to say that some 60% of Australia's trade goes through the South China Sea, and there's another factor to take into account here, and that is Australia has made some very unwise decisions on the basis of economic rationality, and it has wound down its refining capacity. And that means it's been importing more refined petroleum from places like Singapore, South Korea, and Japan. And the concern is that a Chinese domination or hostile power domination of the South China Sea would actually result in interdiction of these supplies to Australia. Now, the business community says, oh, that won't happen, the Chinese are reasonable people. But we know very well from past experience with China that this is precisely the kind of thing that China would engage in. Interruption of supplies in order to gain strategic geopolitical advantage. That really concerns us. Now, let's
I seem to have lost you there. Your audio is not working. Could you repeat your last sentence again? Have you muted yourself? Yes, you're back on again. Go ahead, please.
my last sentence, right?
Yes, go ahead, please. Yes, last sentence. Please repeat.
About Chinese interdiction of trade.
Well, we heard that. The next one.
Okay. Okay. I must mention that China has been, the Chinese have been engaging in a campaign in order to change public opinion through the business community of these issues. They've been making donations to political parties, and they've been, there again, using pro-Beijing business people. If they want to have access to the Chinese market, if they want to sell to the Chinese market, they are required in various ways in order to promote Beijing's position. And that appears in the newspaper. And that has become a serious issue for the government, handling the business community with regard to these issues in the South China Sea. We have a politician, former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was a Labour Party Prime Minister, who has very little understanding of strategy, who tells the Australian community that we shouldn't be involved in the South China Sea. And I think that's one good example. He sits on the board of a Chinese investment bank. And I think that's the main reason why he speaks that way. Now, let me then speak about the Indo-Pacific, because the 2013 Defence White Paper stressed the importance of the Indo-Pacific. And this was, I think, an important precedent. We did so before the Americans did. But we're following what Japan Shinzo Abe was doing, fleshing out the idea of Indo-Pacific. However, the Indo-Pacific for Australia may differ somewhat from what Ambassador Sujan mentioned. Here, Ambassador Sujan mentioned the East Coast of Africa. For Australia, it includes the South Pacific as well. That may not interest other people, but it's certainly of concern to us because, and you have Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who says the South Pacific is the front and center of Australia's strategic outlook. Why? Because the Chinese have been making inroads there in the Belt and Road. There are only 13 million people there, and there are 14 sovereign states. 14 sovereign states, however, have votes in the UN. And consider it this way, that gain some control over these countries through Belt and Road financing and so forth, have them vote in the UN, or Chinese committee members in key UN committees, you're able to influence UN opinion in various ways against the United States. The second point here is you're able to a second motivating factor is to use Taiwan's influence as a competitor in the South Pacific. There's a third reason here. There is some evidence to show that the Chinese have been trying to gain strategic control in the South Pacific. In 2018, for example, there was a story to the effect that Vanuatu had been approached by the Chinese to facilitate their use of naval facilities. That caused a great uproar in our country, and also in the United States. And then people in Vanuatu backed off. There's some substance behind this that really concerned us. A permanent military presence was the word. And you have other incidences in Tonga, Bougainville. You have, for example, in Tonga, you have a country of 108,000 people, and they own almost 108 million to China, because under the Belt and Road, equivalent to about 25% of their GDP. Now, that concerns us, this depth diplomacy, how China can gain control in the South Pacific, and use that in order to turn the flank against the United States. Now, I've got a few more minutes left, but let's...
Yes, if you could wind up in the next couple of minutes, please.
I wanted to talk about Japan, that Australia's role in trilateralism and quadrilateralism, that Japan has relationship with Japan has really blossomed and really taken off strategically in terms of trilateralism, in terms of defense ties. With India, we suspect that India has not forgiven Australia for withdrawing from the Quad back in 2008. And we suspect that that's the reason why India did not allow Australia to join the Malabar series of naval exercises. And though no invitation has been issued, we understand that India is more partial towards inviting Australia. We would like to see Australia join those series of exercises. We would like to see Australia's ties with India on the same level as our ties with Japan and the United States. We would like to see equality in terms of security and defense relationships within the Quad in order to boost the Quad's significance as a security relationship. Some would use that phrase as a deterrent device against China and its activities, not only in the South China Sea, but also in the Indian Ocean. Now, I conclude on that point, that on this point, that we are economically vulnerable before China. We're facing acute Chinese economic coercion. That's the phrase used by our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. Economic coercion to back off. We are being targeted by China. In our institute, we had 2 visits by from a delegation from the Chinese PLA. They really wanted to promote their view of the South China Sea, their view of the Indo-Pacific. They wanted to somehow move Australia from these relationships that make up the Quad in the Indo-Pacific. And for us, for Australia, the Indo-Pacific is a matter of restoring a rules-based order and a mechanism to prevent one power from dominating the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. And for that reason, it's important for us to boost these relationships with Japan, US, and also India. I conclude on that point.
Thank you very much, Professor Leszek Buzinski, for your very perceptive remarks and for throwing fresh light on the evolving Australian position. And on another occasion, we will, of course, ask you to tell us more about how the regions in the federal system in Australia, how the regions also pull away in terms of their own policies towards China. Western Australia, in particular, for instance, so dependent it is on the Chinese market for its natural resources and iron ore, etc., that you'll see a much greater involvement of politicians there, not just the business, in promoting very close ties with China, sometimes to the detriment of Australia's own security. And thank you also for pointing out the importance of South Pacific, where not just Australia, but New Zealand too is trying to work in tandem with you to do more to support the sovereignty of those countries and prevent debt diplomacy. After all, the two heavyweights for that part of the oceanic space in the Pacific are traditionally Australia and New Zealand. So it's logical that you would lead the charge of the Light Brigade there against the insidious efforts being made by China to undermine existing structures there. I now turn to Professor Hideshi Tokuchi to speak about the South China Sea and Japan's perspective. Of course, he will tell us all this in light of the fact that Japan is also making efforts to improve its relations with China and bring them out of a tailspin in which they had been since roughly 2012, and how Japan used the anniversaries in 2017 and 18, the anniversaries of the establishment of diplomatic ties and the Treaty of Peace and Friendship in order to improve relations with China. And now we have the added factor of Prime Minister Abe having just resigned. And will that necessarily mean a change in Japan's positions? I believe myself that there will be continuity, but we will hear it from him. So over to you, Professor Tokuchi. The floor is yours.
Ambassador Chinoy, thank you. Thank you very much. Although I wanted to use my PowerPoint presentation, I am afraid that the connection is choppy. Therefore, I have decided not to use the PowerPoint presentation. Well, the title of my presentation is the South China Sea and Japan's National Security. And anyway, first of all, let me thank the organizers of this very important event today. And my special thanks go, of course, to Ambassador Sujan Chinoy. Thank you very much for the invitation, and good to see you again, sir. And also, my special thanks go to Dr. Tan Hai-do, my old friend, and now Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of Vietnam in New Delhi. I deeply appreciate the kind invitation to discuss an issue of great importance to the regional and Japanese national security together with these distinguished panelists. Well, East Asia has two faces, continental and maritime. However, it is almost a cliche that East Asia is a seascape. And Japan defines itself as a maritime nation, and it is explicitly stated in its national security strategy, which was established in 2013 under the strong leadership of Prime Minister Abe. And when the Japanese government launched its vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific in 2016, its emphasis was no doubt on the connectivity of the two oceans, namely the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. The 3 points, the 3 pillars of this vision, FOIP vision, include promotion of the fundamental principles of the rules-based liberal international order and initiatives to promote peace and security in this region. Now, the sea is one. And that's why the sea is critically important as global commons. And the importance of maritime traffic for mass transportation is incomparable to land traffic and air traffic. Therefore, connectivity of the two oceans is indispensable to the regional and global security and prosperity. So, the importance of the South China Sea couldn't be overstated. It is the South China Sea is the sea geographically connecting the two great oceans. Through the South China Sea passes about half of the world's maritime trade, half of its LNG, and a third of its seaborne crude oil. In terms of fishing, the annual catch from the South China Sea is more than 10% of the world total, which means that it is a large source of food protein particularly for the Asians. And there is even an estimate that the total amount of oil and natural gas is at levels similar to that of the Middle East. For today's Japan, around a quarter of all the crude oil passing through the South China Sea is headed towards Japan. And more than half of all the natural gas passing through the South China Sea is headed to Japan. Protection of the maritime ecosystem is also important for Japan and the region, particularly from the viewpoint of preservation of fishery resources. In terms of maritime security, the South China Sea is important for the flow of military forces of Japan and also of Japan's ally, the United States, stationed in Japan, particularly the US forces stationed in Japan between the two oceans. Just think about the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden and off the coast of Somalia. It's evident. I also would like to point out that Japan's immediate security concern on the East China Sea is closely linked to the eroding situation in the South China Sea. The two seas are linked with each other by China's assertive actions. China engineers maritime gray zone warfare using its maritime law enforcement vessels and maritime militia. Back in 2012, when maritime militia trawlers of China were netting tons of endangered species at Scarborough Shoal, and Philippine vessel boarded two of the trawlers, the militiamen on board radioed for help, and China Coast Guard ships came in and rowed to the rescue. A Chinese researcher uses the phrase Scarborough Shoal model, and that researcher emphasizes that model was explored vis-a-vis China's gray zone incursions into Japan's waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands in the South China Sea, with the presence of China Coast Guard ships together with many so-called fishing boats. Today's world is occupied with the fight against the novel coronavirus. The world pays little attention to the traditional security issue in the South China Sea. It's very unfortunate. However, China's assertive actions have not stopped even in this difficult age. We must continue to cooperate to prevent the Chinese from establishing a fait accompli. The pandemic has been intensifying the US-China rivalry. It is not just a geopolitical struggle. It's a competition of worldviews and also of models of political governance. The rules-based order continues to be challenged by the revisionist power. If we do not uphold the rules-based order, there will be no just solution to the South China Sea issue. Unfortunately, the pandemic makes international cooperation difficult as the flow of people is blocked and trainings and exercises are suspended. However, communication is easier in this digital age. Medical and health cooperation paves the way for new areas of security cooperation as well. We can take advantage of these new things. So we have many things to cooperate on. So my suggestion is as follows. First, we must keep raising the international public awareness of the South China Sea issue. by disclosing what's going on over there. Second, efforts for a larger framework for maritime crisis management remains critical. I'm not so sure about how the code of conduct negotiations are going on, but there are some other measures worthy of serious consideration, including extending some elements of the current naval code for unplanned encounters at sea, or naval queues, to maritime law enforcement agencies. Third, maritime domain awareness and air domain awareness must be improved. Sharing and disseminating information about China's actions in the sea, particularly in the South China Sea, is crucial for raising international public awareness and for crisis management. And finally, more efforts are must also to preserve the balance of power in this region, in the South China Sea region. For this purpose, security capacity building assistance must be extended much more to the regional countries. For recent example, the government of Japan announced last week on August 28th that a Japanese manufacturer signed a contract with the Philippine Defense Ministry to provide warning and control radars for the Philippine Air Force. Concerted efforts of like-minded industrial democracies are increasingly needed to keep up the momentum for improving the maritime security capacity and capability of Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for your attention. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hideshi Tokuchi, for your very perceptive remarks. It clarified a number of our own doubts about Japan's position. And you did very successfully emphasize the importance of maritime traffic for Japan. It's a lifeline for Japan. And I think all students of history are reminded that when such supply lines are interdicted, it can lead to very, very strong responses. Japan itself entered the Second World War after its maritime traffic was interdicted. Its energy supplies were being interdicted in the Pacific by the United States. That led to your entering the Second World War. One of the factors why you went into Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. So this is very clear. It has happened before in the First World War with the German U-boats also interdicting merchant shipping that was so essential for the European adversaries like France, etc. Now, COC negotiations you did mention, but look, I think the irony here is that it is China that is in a better position today to shape the outcome of the code of conduct. None of the others are involved. And with the kind of undue dependence that's been created among the ASEAN, both for economic prosperity and for security, as I mentioned earlier, the issue here is what kind of an outcome is it going to be? Will it really favor China more than anything else? So with these very remarkable sort of thoughts that you shared with us, there's more work for all of us to look into Japan's position. Thank you for that. I now turn to Dr. Bin Thai Lai to tell us about Vietnam's perspective and also perhaps tell us if Vietnam really has a very clear-cut policy, or is it still in a position where one can say or suspect that it's sitting on the fence, or that it dreads the day when there might be a kinetic engagement between the United States and China, for that would force Vietnam to take sides. I think you'll bring all that out in your presentation. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Vietnam will join the international community's efforts. Okay, so can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, excellent. Level 5. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So, Ambassador Sujan Chinoy, Ambassador Phan Sinh Châu, Dr. Singh, ladies and gentlemen, I have my honor to speak today about Vietnam's perspective, and actually it's more personal perspective on the South China Sea webinar, Interpreting South China Sea's Significance in the Indo-Pacific. And in about 10 or 15 minutes, I'd like to discuss the opportunities and challenges for the region and implications for international relations related to the South China Sea issue, which is also known as the East Sea in Vietnam. First, there continues to exist many challenges for the region and international cooperation in the South China Sea. And as you said, at present, our region is facing a lot of problems with complicated and unpredictable developments, spanning in many fields from traditional security to non-traditional security. The COVID-19 situation is still having a profound impact on many countries in the region. In the meantime, the international and regional communities continue to pay attention to various developments in China-US relations with multi-dimensional assessment. Besides, the number of disputes at sea has not decreased, but is increasing with many different forms and degrees. So the situation of the South China Sea in recent years has exacerbated security challenges in the region and in international relations, and which can be generalized in the following main points. First, misunderstanding, non-recognition or violation of provisions of UNCLOS 1982 undermines the effectiveness of the international legal system in general and the efficiency of applying UNCLOS 1982 in the settlement of maritime disputes in particular. Second, the implementation of gunboat diplomacy, as you said at the beginning, or strategic competition among great powers makes the South China Sea a more important issue of the region, but accompanied by threats to change the regional order, first to peace, stability, and development. And third, the South China Sea issue is prolonged and entails many consequences, seriously affecting the development and legitimate rights of people in coastal countries, partly affects efforts to strengthen regional economic linkages and development cooperation. I believe that the cause of this situation is many, but some key factors can be taken into account, such as the difficulty of the current situation, like the COVID-19 epidemic, which is slowing down development cooperation, the internal political and economic complication in some countries, especially China. And countries still have difficulty finding and implementing possible solutions to the South China Sea issue. Experts and scholars from many countries believe that challenges are the main and the dominant factor in the South China Sea issue, even in the coming time, and most of which can come from the above-mentioned reasons. On the other hand, the South China Sea is also a place with many potential opportunities for regional and international cooperation. Personally, I think opportunity and challenges are intertwined. In some issues, opportunities are transformed into challenges, but sometimes challenges bring up good opportunities. The current context also offers many opportunities for the region. First, the so-called legal warfare that some countries inside and even outside the region are interested in and participating in. We have clarified more clearly the content and interpretation of international law, especially the UNCLOS 1982. And this, in the long run, we benefit the development of the region by creating a momentum to have the region gradually clarify interpret and apply international law more effectively. Second, countries we study and we have the demand for further discussion of many legal mechanisms and measures based on international law to maintain the status of bilateral security with other countries and with the region, in which we are not mentioning the South China Sea issue only, but the East China Sea or the India-China border dispute. I mean, there are many. And third, regional countries, we actively participate more in multilateral forums, conferences, like the one we are participating today, and promoting substantive cooperation, sharing more information, and creating unity for the entire ASEAN bloc, which is very important for the region, not only for the cooperation among ASEAN countries, but also for the cooperation between ASEAN bloc and other countries in and out of the region. And although some Vietnamese experts believe that there are more challenges than opportunities related to the security issues in general and to the South China Sea issue in particular, I still hold my view that challenges and opportunities are intertwined and mutually transformable if we actively cooperate and strive to find innovative solutions. So, what will be the way ahead for further improving the South China Sea issue? In the current complicated regional security context, it is very welcome that the majority of countries have made great efforts and are willing to contribute to the peaceful settlement of all conflict and disputes. In fact, the policies and measures of all countries are very cautious, including India, I personally think. And all of us always want to balance the national interest, the bilateral and multilateral interest in this context. So, with the aim of creating a common consensus among regional countries, contributing to maintaining regional peace, security, stability, and development, as well as in the South China Sea, I would like to make the following recommendation. First, there should be persistent efforts to maintain the rules-based regional order. Countries need to respect the rules of international law, have mutual respect, and resolve conflicts through peaceful means. And as I understand, this is the spirit, the important points that Ambassador Pham Seng Châu mentioned and wanted to emphasize in his delivered speech. Second, consideration should be given to further improving the performance of existing bilateral and multilateral mechanisms in the region, especially in relation to ASEAN. This is very important and it's feasible. But in the meantime, we need to discuss the alternative or supplemental cooperation mechanism toward the South China Sea issue. And I think this is where we have a lot of opportunities for India, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, other countries, the US, to further expand our cooperation and new kinds of activity. And it is also in line with Ambassador, Pham Seng Châu in mentioning that we need stronger measures if required. Third, there is a need to intensify discussion and exchange of experiences to contribute to the resolution of maritime disputes in certain areas in which the South China Sea is only a specific case. And Professor Tokuchi also mentioned that the East China Sea is somehow related, closely to the status of South China Sea, and I totally agree with him about the connection, between these two issues, and not only between these two issues, also with other regional or international security issues. And by promoting the discussion and exchange of information and experiences, we need to, discuss and propose, stronger policy recommendation and action, like the follow-up among the interested countries for the joint military exercise in the common sea. And I think that we have a lot of opportunities for the further innovative solution here in the time to come. And fourth, like-minded countries should continue to strengthen comprehensive cooperation, including promoting stances to align with joint efforts and increasing economic and trade cooperation to support solving the South China Sea issue. And as Ambassador Chinoy mentioned before, or also Professor Buzinski, he mentioned one important concept, which is the strategic autonomy. And I believe that strategic autonomy or strategic interdependence in the new situation also matter a lot in order to support the solving of the South China Sea issue. And fifth, it is necessary to adopt many channels and levels of communication discussion, especially the role of scholars and people-to-people exchange are very important to build and strengthen mutual trust. And it is not only among like-minded countries, between Vietnam, Australia, Japan, or other countries, but between us and China. So I believe that with an objective view of the South China Sea issue and thinking positively to appreciating and promoting the advantages and opportunities for cooperation between the concerned country in the South China Sea disputes, and proactively informing people to understand the current issue, avoiding misunderstanding or causing a wave of extreme nationalism, will help us take a step forward in the South China Sea issue in the coming time. And finally, I'd like to thank you for your listening, and I wish the webinar a great success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bin Thai Lai, for your remarks. You highlighted many important points, but what strikes me in all this discourse that we've had so far is also the fact that in law, possession is 9 parts of the law. And the unfortunate part in the South China Sea is that for many decades, a certain situation has been allowed to develop. There's been a certain drift also until the recent pushback. You go back to 1974, and you have the People's Republic of China taking islands in the Paracels by force. And this is at a time when the Americans are still very much present in South Vietnam. And for whatever geopolitical reason, this fact accompli takes shape in 1974. You have the Chinese moving in unilaterally again in 1995 and taking over Mischief Reef. You also have the Chinese unilaterally taking over Scarborough Shoal in 2012. And it seems to me that the so-called pivot to Asia in President Obama's second term was really something that remained in words, not in deeds. President Trump's administration has tried to redress that gap and to make a concerted effort to draw some red lines in the South China Sea. But this is after the horses have bolted. It's like akin to shutting the barn door after the horse is bolted. And the real pivot, some might say, is the one that China has effected in the South China Sea and in Asia at large. So these are complex issues, and I hope we will continue to benefit from your thoughts in the future as well. And last but not the least, is my esteemed colleague, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, who will now deliver his remarks. And may I request all our attendees to kindly use the Q&A box in the meantime to pose whatever questions they have. All the non-speakers at this stage may kindly take a peek into their Q&A box. I will endeavor to read out the questions at the end, but you might benefit from seeing them a little in advance. So the floor is yours, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh.
Thank you, sir. As the last speaker, I really do not have too much to add to what has been said by the speakers, the panelists so far, except to say that this South China Sea dispute has continued for a long time and it is yet to find a solution. And the conflict has its roots in a fight over resources and differences over sovereignty. And on top of this, the COVID-19 has upset all calculations for an optimistic start to 2020. China has chosen this adversity to make gains in the South China Sea. And this has implications not only for China's neighbors, especially Vietnam and big powers like USA, Japan, Australia, but it also has implications for India. China's resort to salami slicing, the 3Ws strategy, 3 warfare strategy, media, psychological warfare and confrontation, especially on India-China border in our eastern Ladakh region since April 2020. This has shown us that there is a linkage between our border with China and the maritime border that Vietnam has or Philippines has with China. This linkage is becoming more pronounced as time has passed. India's experience with China at the border has inevitably led to the establishment of this linkage between the line of actual control and the South China Sea. So we face similar predicament and circumstances are bringing distant countries together in a cooperative mode. Just as India accused China of unilaterally trying to alter the status quo at the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh, Vietnam has faced similar problems in the South China Sea when their maritime territory has been nibbled at by China in the South China Sea. We see that the conflict in the South China Sea has been a contributory factor also in accelerating military modernization and defense procurement programs of some of the Indo-Pacific countries has also accelerated because of that. At the start of this year, we hoped that we were optimistic about the Indo-Pacific, but now some concern is being expressed about where the center of geopolitics and geoeconomics and major power contestation will lie. This year has assumed great importance with Vietnam assuming chairmanship of ASEAN. Vietnam will also be joining as non-permanent member of UN Security Council next year along with India. And it's also an important year for Vietnam's 25th year of admittance to ASEAN. Vietnam, of course, set out its priorities with regard to the region when it brought out its latest defense white paper with its 4 no's: no military alliance, no affiliation with one country to counteract the other, no foreign military bases in the Vietnamese territory. But the COVID-19 pandemic went on to overwhelm not just the Indo-Pacific, but the entire globe. So under these circumstances, I'm sure Vietnam is also having reconsiderations about some of the ideas that it has set forward to itself, set before itself. The pandemic itself was not a black swan event, and in many ways, it only established, re-established, and reconfirmed the trends that had already been existing. The developments in the South China Sea, particularly, even while the world was grappling with COVID-19 pandemic, China got back to its ambitious goal of reasserting itself in South China Sea. China had prepared the ground for a series of moves that were to be followed in April by shooting of diplomatic notes to the UN. First, it was done in December 2019, then in March this year. We've seen China being very proactive in the legal warfare that was mentioned earlier by some of the panelists. And this requires the other countries of the region in Indo-Pacific to be fully aware of this legal warfare and respond in a similar manner to these aims of China. Vietnam was also faced with 3 provocations from China: an attack on its fishing boat, second, Beijing establishment of 2 administrative districts on islands claimed by Vietnam, and naming 80 geographical entities in the South China Sea. These kind of attacks on Vietnamese vessels has been ongoing. Vietnam, of course, considered it an infringement of its sovereignty over the Hon Sa Islands, which it claims on historical and legal grounds. But it would appear that whatever the differences are, there needs to be cooperation amongst all the Indo-Pacific countries to deal with this menace. Among the ASEAN countries that came out with a statement in solidarity with Vietnam has been the Philippines. When the Department of Foreign Affairs expressed deep concern over reported sinking in April of Vietnamese fishing vessel in the South China Sea. The Philippines reminded China of the ASEAN-China joint commitment to collectively tackle the pandemic in the statement of the special ASEAN-China foreign ministers meeting on the coronavirus disease that was issued way back in February 2020. Besides Vietnam and the Philippines, Malaysia also had to deal with Beijing while simultaneously fighting the COVID-19 crisis. Malaysian exploration vessel was tagged by the notorious Chinese survey ship Hang Dizzy 8, which had earlier been active in Vietnamese waters. It was accompanied by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel at that time. Malaysia's slow response prompted criticism from its former foreign minister. The Malaysian foreign minister merely spoke of the need for South China Sea to remain a sea of peace and trade. The Chinese double standards in coercing smaller neighbors in the South China Sea on the one hand, and insisting that others be sensitive to its concern about Taiwan and Tibet is becoming increasingly evident. So perhaps some of the countries may need to reconsider the one China policy and consider we would perhaps also need to reconsider our so far very diplomatic approach towards China. The US has taken some very strong measures. They have come out with strong statements which are now in consonance with the arbitration court of 2016 ruling, as Ambassador Chinoy had also mentioned. So this is a very important development where we see some of the major powers taking a bold position on the South China Sea. I think this has to be carried further by Japan and Australia as well. We have also seen that there is a need to cooperate with the other major powers, and I would say that even with Russia, we need to see its role in the Indo-Pacific. India, of course, had to pull out of some military exercises in Russia due to the COVID crisis, but the two navies would now hold joint maneuvers near the Andaman and Nicobar Islands tomorrow and day after, coinciding with our defense minister visit to Moscow, and that would again be indicative of our position on the Indo-Pacific. The Indra Navy 2020 planned in Vladivostok has been postponed, but the PASIX or the passage exercises to maintain continuity of engagement between India and Russia will be continued. Two Russian Navy destroyers, one tanker would take part in passage of Russian ships from Hambantota to Malacca Straits in the Bay of Bengal. This again is to re-emphasize the importance of our tri-service command at Andaman and Nicobar Islands and our position that we would welcome participation by some of the major Indo-Pacific powers in security exercises in the offshore Andaman and greater participation in this region. Interestingly, Indo-Russian exercise would happen in the same area where the Malabar exercises involving India, the US and Japan will take place later this year. Australia could also be invited for this exercise. So the growing importance of the Indo-Pacific, the growing importance of the Malacca Strait, and our growing concern about Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean is as important as our interest in the Indo-Pacific, which in the South China Sea, which is seen, of course, by the participation of our warship in the South China Sea recently. So to conclude, I would say that amongst the suggestions that I have for this group is that we should have greater such dialogues for such time as we cannot meet physically. We should have more interactions with our partners in Vietnam, Japan, Australia. As already mentioned, we have dialogue partnership with 3 of the institutes in Vietnam, and we look forward to greater cooperation with them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, and also for underscoring the fact that there's a common thread that runs through the kind of Chinese assertiveness and aggression that we see on India's borders and what we see in terms of Chinese actions in the East China Sea and the South China Sea as well. As for Russia, it's very important that if the Russians, as a Pacific power, are to be in the Indian Ocean, much better for them to come in a tandem with a country like India, rather than allow them to come in with unsavory partners like China and some might say Iran as well, as they have exercised in the Straits of Hormuz as well. So that's something that I would recommend, that if the Russians were to be engaged, much better that traditional friendly powers who understand Russia and can also influence them should engage them in this part of the world. They are not alien to the Indo-Pacific. We all know that, whether the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. So it's better that India engages. I will now very quickly use the remaining time, that is to say, before we run out of time and patience on the part of the attendees, devote a couple of minutes to reading out the questions, assuming that the panelists have also read the same questions, and then run through the entire panel once and give you each a couple of minutes to respond. So for the ambassador of Vietnam, the question is, how do you propose to implement the recent decree against the illegal oil and gas exploration? The backdrop is that China has even managed to get some contracts cancelled by exerting pressure on Vietnam. This is a question posed by Commodore Wasan, all the way from Chennai. He also has another question to Professor Buzinski. What are the measures contemplated to ensure that the business lobbies down under that support Chinese investments and market access are brought under check? I know you're doing a great deal, but this is his question. Against the backdrop that China already has built a large number of constituencies in a methodical manner. It's a daunting task, to say the least. Commodore Mani Singh Mamik has a general question. Is it possible to set up, well, I think our Japanese colleague, Professor Tokuchi, will have to take this. Would you countenance setting up a manned security post in the Senkaku Islands if push came to shove? Because otherwise you have the specter of the PRC landing up and building structures as they've done on rocks in the South China Sea. So your thoughts on that? Again, Commodore Wasan to Professor Tokuchi, how do you see the changing status quo in the South China Sea that's challenged by China and the scant regard that it has for a rules-based order? The rejection by China of any kind of award like the Tribunal Award. In his view, the COC also has limited value. And your thoughts on that? Captain Sarabjit Parmar from the National Maritime Foundation, a question for Dr. Lai. Is Vietnam considering taking China for arbitration like the Philippines did? Well, of course, arbitration requires some kind of acceptance also, and China has so far shown no signs of accepting any kind of award. But your thoughts on that? Another question by Captain Parmar for Professor Buzinski, and this is about the recent meeting in the US where the Australian foreign minister stated that Australia would make its own decisions in its own interests. Nothing questionable about that, but how do you see this impacting on US-Australia relations and the future of the Quad? And lastly, as I see, Captain Parmar again for Tokuchi-san, the US is looking at making the Quad into, in his view, a formal alliance like NATO, and also wishes to see an increase in terms of the Quad Plus dialogue that's currently underway. How feasible do you think is the prospect of all this happening, considering the historical baggage involved? I now quickly give the floor to Ambassador of Vietnam, His Excellency Mr. Pham San Trao. A quick few thoughts, and then I'll move to the others. Floor is yours.
Thank you. I have to switch off my camera in order to get some space, in order to speak, to be more audible.
Your audio has improved vastly, and so we would like to see you as well. Please continue.
Well, we just issued a decree in order to prevent any illegal oil and gas exploration. I think this is a very new decree, and one of the measures we try to prevent illegal oil and gas exploration is that we issue different sanctions against any companies that are violating that regulation. So this is this is quite fresh. It just came out. I think it's a week ago, and I hope that this is a new step towards us that reflect our strong determination of protecting our oil and gas exploration. So it's just quite new, and I hope that will be implemented strictly. Also on that account, for your information, we still have a very good cooperation with ONGC, an Indian oil and gas company, and a Russian company in terms of exploration and of oil and gas in offshore Vietnam. We are also considering, as you may be aware of the fact of the result of the joint commissions between the two countries, we are considering of giving extensions to the contract that we signed between ONGC and Petro Vietnam. And ONGC get a good part stake in that. So I think that is also they also repatriate the benefit annually from this joint venture with Vietnam. In terms of the contract we canceled, I think that this is in our calculation. We calculate. I think there is two. We stopped the explorations because we believe that we finished the explorations already. So having said that, I want to stress that Vietnam is not under any pressure in order to cancel any commercial activities. Thank you.
At this stage, I have just pressed the refresh button on the Q&A box, and I see a large number of cascading questions there. I'm sure the panelists have seen them, but I must not be remiss in my duty. So from Mr. Thuong Nguyen from Vietnam, I take it, he has a question for you, Ambassador, and for Dr. Lai. And how do you evaluate Vietnam's hedging strategy? I referred to it in my remarks as well. I called it sitting on the fence, or perhaps not wanting to take sides, but he has put it far more elegantly. And how did Vietnam not predict China's reclamation and island building projects in the South China Sea? Something to that effect. And is this a failure, in your view, of long-term policy evaluation and intelligence gathering? Captain Parmar, I think I've relayed his questions, but Mr. Nguyen has another question for Professor Buzinski. What do you think about the idea of permanently establishing Quad as a more concrete regional institution, something akin to the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA? That's my addition there to his question. For Australia, should the Quad focus mainly on security or on other economic and cultural aspects? General Satish Dua, former CISC, he asks, China continues to dominate the South China Sea only because others are not willing to take positions and participate substantively. Well, this is actually true, because I brought out the arbitrary manner in which they took over the South China Sea over the last 3 decades and nobody did a thing about it. Need of the hour, in his view, is to have an active mechanism like Quad or Quad Plus and share maritime information, and what can be done to hasten that. Anyone is free to answer that. Again, from Mr. Nguyen, I don't know how many questions he has, but it seems to have filled the screen up over here. To Indian participants, the question is, that is, Uday, you are the Indian participant today. I've spoken a lot, so you take this one. Is India willing to move from non-alignment principle to a more practical approach in its foreign policy? What are the reasons for keeping or moving away from it, given the current complex regional security environment? So your thoughts on India's strategic autonomy there. Mr. Deepak Kumar, he asks, can we foresee ASEAN members to be part of a common security dialogue, possibly join the Quad companies for helping Beijing advance its territorial claims in the South China Sea? It seems to be a fact. In your view, how effective will be these measures that you just cited on the part of Vietnam in putting an end to all that? Will the rest of ASEAN similarly consider such measures? I hope they do. Chow Tran says, after Eastern Ladakh crisis, does India's approach to the South China Sea change? Is it going to be reconsidered? Well, I suppose that's it. I'll give you another minute, Ambassador, because we can't have you sign off without a quick minute on this. Then I would promptly turn to the rest of the speakers in that order.
Thank you very much. Number one, on the hedging policy, what we call in our foreign policy is that we have independence foreign policy. We have learned that a lesson from the past that we should not take side with any countries in order to fight the other countries. That lessons we learned from the Vietnam War. So from now we pursued an independent foreign policy. And it's very similar to India. You call it strategic independence. So you can term it as you like, hedging or not hedging. That's number one. Number two, in terms of the sanction, I think that U.S. have a sanction law, and they can do whatever they like because this is their own. They have USA is a sovereign country. We don't have any comment on that. What we can say is that we welcome any contribution from outside or inside regional player to contribute to make sure that peace and stability will be observed in this part of the world. Finally, I also see here about the whether Vietnam will take China for arbitration. As has been stated out on various occasions by various leaders of Vietnam, that we open all the channel, diplomatic, political, and and judicial. So we do not exclude any possibility in order to protect our own sovereignty and our interest. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador. I suppose the independent foreign policy is as good or as bad as an independent economic policy. So I suppose Vietnam will have to be very careful on the economic front as well. I now turn to Professor Buzinski. The floor is yours. A few quick thoughts on all these numerous questions.
Right. I think I have three questions to address here. The first one that came up was the business lobby. How would the government deal with the business lobby, which is being manipulated by the Chinese? Now, let me say here that there's one word that I want to introduce here: patriotism. Now, what happened was that this Australian government, that is Scott Morrison, Marise Payne, went public in April and called for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID virus. The Chinese got very angry, and the Chinese ambassador went public and in no uncertain way threatened Australia with economic retaliation. And they imposed tariffs on the imports of Australian barley, some beef, and they're threatening to do the same with wine. Now, that led to a public outrage in Australia. And it seems to me that the Chinese never learned that if they wanted to detach Australia from the American alliance, if they wanted Australia to stay silent over the South China Sea, that's the last thing you do. Public opinion has changed with regard to China. And the public is very much in support of our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. They see him as standing up to China's bullying. So, and this sense, a surge of patriotism has quietened the business community. They're speaking out a lot less these days because of patriotism. Now, that's the first point. The second one about Marise Payne's visit to Washington, Osmin, that is, and the Foreign Minister Marise Payne, the Defense Minister Linda Reynolds, both women, visited Washington under the so-called Osmin talks, and the question was whether or not Marise Payne's statement that Australia would make its own decisions, would that affect the Quad? Now, the issue was quite specific. It had to do with American pressure for Australia to join America in its FONOPS in the South China Sea. Now, Australia has resisted that. It won't join FONOPS, that is to say, send naval vessels within 12 nautical miles of Chinese occupied features, but it has sent naval vessels into the South China Sea for other operations. Just this April, an Australian naval vessel went to the South China Sea and joined American vessels for some training purposes, but not for FONOPS. Australia is very clear that it won't do that. That was a specific issue. It doesn't affect the Quad. It doesn't affect other issues relating to cooperation with the United States, with the US in terms of security. The third question had to do with the Quad. What about the Quad as a regional institution? Certainly, I think everyone in Australia would be in favor of that. And as I said in my presentation, our concern is India, whether India will accept Australia's participation as a fully fledged member of the Quad. Will India accept Australia's participation in the Malabar series of exercises and so forth? That has been the concern on our side. Certainly we'd like to see the Quad as a regional institution, certainly because there's no other way, no other mechanism to engage India, attach India, United States, and Japan, and Australia. This is it. This is an integrative measure to bring India into a wider security community within the Indo-Pacific. We are certainly in favor of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I turn quickly to Professor Hideshi Tokuchi for your thoughts, please.
Well, I understand that I have three questions to address. Thanks very much for all the important questions. First question is about the Senkaku Island. It is from Commodore Manising Manik. Well, as a matter of fact, China's Coast Guard ships have been entering into the continuous zone surrounding the Senkaku Islands almost every day this year, since the beginning of January. And at the same time, they have been intruding into the territorial waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands around twice a month. And they are pretending that they are administering the Senkaku Islands and also the waters surrounding the Senkaku Islands. And last month, Japan was afraid that lots of Chinese fishing boats would come to that area after the end of the annual moratorium of fishing. But fortunately or not, they didn't come. But anyway, the Coast Guard ships are operating still in that area regularly. But so there is a difference of the situation between the South China Sea and the East China Sea. I'm very, very sorry to say in front of the Vietnamese friends, but generally speaking, Southeast Asians are militarily weak. And unfortunately, there is no permanent presence of the US military forces over there. But in contrast, in the East China Sea, there is a formidable military and law enforcement capability of Japan. And at the same time, permanent presence of the United States. One US carrier battle group is stationed in Japan. Of course, I'm not saying that we can be safe. We must continue to be cautious and prepared because of various reasons. China's military is expanding its capability, and also China's law enforcement capabilities are increasing very rapidly. Therefore, we have to be very, very, careful, and we have to keep watching out. But I would like to emphasize that the situation of the balance of power is different from the situation in the South China Sea. Second question is about quote from Dr.
May I request all non-speakers to kindly mute their mics, please? All other non-speakers will kindly check their mics and mute them. Please continue, Professor Tokuchi.
Okay. To answer the question about the Quad and Quad Plus posed by Dr. Palmas. The Quad is a group of major maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific, and all of them have capabilities to uphold the rules-based liberal international order in that region. In that sense, the Quad is a promising coalition, and Japan and Australia both countries are close allies of the United States in the Indo-Pacific. And in my understanding, India is an autonomous country, but I understand that India knows that India cannot counter China all on its own. Therefore, a stronger partnership with the United States and US allies is important for the security of India as well. Therefore, I think that Quad is a good, can be a good, partnership. But and also, last September, the first meeting of the foreign ministers of the Quad members was held for the first time. But still, Quad is a very informal, informal one. Therefore, in my view, it is necessary to institutionalize the Quad, and that's the first thing to come. And then, the rules-based liberal international order cannot be maintained by those four countries alone. It's for everyone. Therefore, Quad must be expanded. In that sense, Quad Plus is a good idea. But before that, we have to think about the institutionalizing the Quad. And finally, I would like to answer the question about the South China Sea order posed by Commodore R.S. Vasan. I am afraid that the international public is forgetful. And also the public is not interested in legal technicalities, such as in the legal features of the maritime features in the South China Sea. July 12th was this year, was the 4th anniversary of the historic verdict by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. But very unfortunately, that historic ruling is becoming just a history. On that day, Philippine foreign minister issued a statement saying that the verdict is not negotiable, but it didn't attract big attention in the international public. So it's very unfortunate. But if we forget the South China Sea issue, it's exactly what China wants. And last year in the Shangri-La dialogue, China's defense minister said that every year thousands of merchant ships sail through the South China Sea without any problem about the freedom of navigation. And China's ambassador to the United Kingdom had said almost exactly the same thing in London, writing to a British paper. So every time when China says such kind of things, we have to counter, those, false argument. So we have to keep the South China Sea issues alive. That's a must, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Tokuchi. Before I turn to Dr. Lai, I must just respond to one small point about India not necessarily being able to go it alone with China and requiring to cooperate with others in the Quad. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that in the Quad, there are three countries with a primarily maritime posture, that is the United States, Australia, and Japan. And India is the one that has more than one chestnut in the fire. And our biggest chestnut in the fire is actually our land borders. And I don't think there is anyone who would aver that the Quad countries are readily going to involve themselves or embed themselves in India's territorial disputes, particularly with China. So I suppose when we look at the Quad, we have to do so in totality in terms of how the Quad is to position itself on intractable disputes in the future. It will obviously not be a very selective approach, in my view, and everybody's interests will have to be taken on board. I now turn to Dr. Lai.
Thank you, Ambassador Chinoy. And, at the same time, I just typed some of my answers to the question. So the other people can read and have a better understanding of the Vietnamese perspective. But here, I'd like to take time to emphasize some important points. Vietnam, as Ambassador Pham Sinh Cho said, Vietnam is open to all options, and we are ready for all options, and we are, preparing everything accordingly to that scenario. And as Professor Tokuchi said, just mentioned that ASEAN countries are weak, in not only in security issues but also economic, and I mean we can say about being weak, in many aspects, and that means although ASEAN is very important, in order to solve complicated issues, we need to cooperate more with each other and with other countries. So here, joint efforts are very important and key to the cooperation toward solving the important issues. And last but not least, I think that one of the most important things toward the South China Sea issue and also the East China Sea issue or other issues, security issues in the region, is that we need to have a common policy. As I can see, the countries in the region and countries out of the region have very different policies and different measures or actions. I mean, the US, India, Japan, Australia, ASEAN countries, we have different perspectives and we have different policies. Here, Ambassador Pham Sinh Cho mentioned one very important notion. That is, we shouldn't take side with any specific party or countries, but we take side with the international law and with the UNCLOS 1982. And by saying that, I think that we need to cooperate more, work more with each other in order to have a more condensed common policies towards the South China Sea issue. And by saying that, I think that there will be more opportunities for us to work with each other to make it more specific and effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lai. We just have one more speaker. That's Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh, who I thank for having also worked hard to set up this webinar. And precisely because you contributed more than the rest of us, Uday, you can have the last word. But before I turn over to you for that, I also want to acknowledge the presence today also of my esteemed colleague, the Deputy Director General, General Bipin Bakshi, who has joined us recently as the Deputy Director General of our institute. So with these few words now, Uday, your take finally, and you can perhaps even summarize the whole thing in a few words, please. Thank you. Please unmute your mic. Uday, please unmute your mic. You're on now. Go ahead.
There were two questions that were addressed to me. One with regard to non-alignment. I think now we have crossed that stage where we are so much concerned about ideological differences. What I think India is doing is it is looking at issues on merit, and our relationship with other countries is governed by that. Our relationship with countries is, in a sense, if you want to call it strategic autonomy, but we are basically looking at what suits the current situation, and in a sense, we are more realistic about it in dealing with the situation. The other question was with regard to US would be under pressure from China. I think it is China which is under pressure from the international community as regards the 2016 judgment that came from the arbitral court. The kind of position that China took while having signed and ratified the UNCLOS and not yet following the decision of the court, and this compares compared with India's position on following the court with regard to the decision between India and Bangladesh maritime boundary. Even though it went against us, we followed the multilateral court's decision on the matter, even though we stood to lose territory on that score. But I think eventually, if all major powers are on board, it would be the best kind of situation for the world, and we would need to perhaps work towards that. I think by and large, I mean, I can hardly sum up the very rich discussion that took place today, and I think we've had the good fortune of having Dr. Businski from Australia, His Excellency Ambassador Pansan Chow to give the keynote address. We had from Vietnam, Dr. Bin Thai Lai, and we had, I think, a fairly rich discussion chaired by Director General Ambassador Chinoy.
And we also had Professor Tokuchi from Japan.
Professor Tokuchi, of course, from Japan. I told him that my name stands for Rising Sun, and so I have a close link with your country. So we are absolutely grateful for having had this discussion today, and thank you all for joining us in this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Uday Bhanu Singh. And with these words, we bring to an end today's webinar. As has been mentioned by my colleague, very rich discussions, and I'm sure also a good harvest in terms of the thoughts that have been expressed, which will be food for further thought. We can all go back and try and research these themes that have been discussed today with the kind of seriousness that they deserve. And once again, on my part, I thank you all for your generosity of time and will not stand between you and the rest of the day. I wish you good health and success in all your endeavors. Thank you very much. Good day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.